Kalina.
Go.
This is Abby Kalina on April 8th, and I am interviewing my great-grandpa, Steve Cannistra, in Grandma and Grandpa's house in Greenfield, where they lived since 1954. Okay, so our first question is, Grandpa, you've talked a lot about this before, but I would like to know about how your family got to America and landed in Milwaukee.
Well, my father was here before my mother, and my mother, he sent for my mother after he got here, and my mother at that time lived in near Palermo in Sicily, and she came here with two children, a boy and a girl. At that time, they might have been, I don't know the exact date, but they were here about 1912 or 1913.
All right, so I know your mom, Conjetta, came over on a boat to meet your dad, who came over previously. Can you tell me more details about your mom's ride over, who came with her, or how your dad got here?
Well, evidently, like I said, my father was here, and most of the Italians that were coming over, and most naturally they went through Ellis Island, and then they came to Milwaukee, and then they had, like anything else, most of the Italian people lived in a particular area. They called it the Third Ward, which was south of Wisconsin Avenue, and from the lake maybe to, let's say, 3rd Street, which would be probably about 3/4 of a mile. It would be from the lake to 3rd Street would be about the length about 3/4 of a mile, and the same from Wisconsin Avenue to where the 3rd Ward was, which would have been another 3/4 of a mile. So it would be about a 3/4 mile square, and they congregated in there.
Okay. How old were you when your dad died?
I was 8 years old.
Okay. And how did that affect your family?
Well, when I thinking about it, it was quite a tragedy, because my mother at that time had 8 children, can't speak English. My father was the breadwinner, and under those circumstances, I would say it was a real tragedy.
What was the order of your siblings, and then what are some skills or stories that you have about them?
Well, when I was 8 years old, the youngest, total, my mother had, first of all, had 8 children. She had 9 when she came over with the 2 children, which would be Steve was maybe about 8 years old, or not even. No, Steve, the firstborn was a boy, and I think that he was born 1908, and I think she came about 1912, or 13. He was about 4 or 5, and his sister was my sister Mary, and she was 2 years younger. And then, in answer to that other question, Milwaukee, and I should say Wisconsin, was a socialist state, and evidently she was able to go on with, the state of Wisconsin had a program which would be widow's pension, and at that time, my oldest sister Mary, when my father died in 28, she was maybe about 19, and all the children were when she was on widow's pension, they each used to get $10 a month, and they would subsidize the rent and like heat and so on and so forth. But it was a hard time for her. And incidentally, my mother lived to be 103, and she still didn't speak fluent English.
What was it like for your family during the Great Depression?
Well, during the Great Depression, there were many people that were on welfare, which would they call it? You'd be on the county. And then thinking back, I think by my mother being on widow's pension, it was a little better because of the fact that she could receive that money for $10 per kid, and then she'd be in a position to. But you had a uh, uh, you had to itemize whatever you bought, like food and that, and they had to be aware of where that money was going. But at least we could pick and choose.
Mm-hmm. All right, what was your first job as a kid?
Your grandpa here, that's me, wasn't much of a worker. And my first job, I think my first job was I was a busboy. I had later on in life, when my sisters got married, I had a brother-in-law that was a chef, and he got me a job in a hotel, and I was a busboy.
Nice. What was schooling like for you? Did you ever go to school?
Yes, I went to school. I went to grade school. I went to the very first Rotary school, grade school.
Mm-hmm.
By that I mean is you had like if you were in 5B or 5A, the first hour and a half, the A would go for a half hour, for 3 half hours. They would go to history and so on, and geography, and the other half, the B, would stay in the homeroom, and then they would swap. Then the other one would come back to the homeroom, and at one time in my life, I was going to go to St. John's School at St. John's Cathedral, but it was one of these where you sat in the room and you just took the book out. If you were going to study history, you took the history book out, and then arithmetic and so on and so forth. And I had to go back to that Rotary school. I was so involved with the freedom that I had by going from class to class that I went to that school. And then high school was strictly Rotary too.
Nice. So moving on a little bit, how did World War II affect you and Grandma?
Well, we were very fortunate. I had two brothers that were in the service, and I also was in the service. And I got drafted, and I was very fortunate because at that particular time, that quota that was being drafted was the priority was to build a big Air Force, and I took a variety of aptitude tests, and I proved to do pretty good with radio operating, Morse code, and then I was fortunate enough to be in the Air Corps. My other two brothers, one of them went to Japan, was in the Pacific, and then he came back safely. And my other brother never left the States, but he was a little older, so he didn't go in. I went in 1942. I was the first to go in. I was 21, and my younger brother, which would be 19, he went in about the end of 42 or the early 43, and then my older brother went in. He was, according to that draft board, they were taking like older people, like 27 or 28, and then he went in, but he stayed in the States.
Okay, you and Grandma had 5 kids. When did you move from
5. We had 8.
Yeah. Okay. But when did you move from Cash Street to Greenfield? Do you remember when? And why?
Well, I got to make you laugh because they used to have an old saying: "It's cheaper to rent. I mean, it's cheaper to move than to pay rent." And we lived in a number of places. When my father died, we lived on like on the east side on Line Street.
Mm-hmm.
Then we moved another 2 times, and then I went in the service. Then when I got out of the service in 1945, and then we lived in when I came back, they had already moved, and then we moved 2 times, and the second time it was to Cass Street, which would be about 1946, and then we stayed on Cass Street for about 2 years. No, wait a minute. Let me see. Yeah, and then I got married, and then most naturally, being married, I lived in other places like a rooming house, and then I wound up moving to Greenfield in 1954.